Sabbath. We are in the middle of our sermon series 2020, Seen with New Eyes. And it's very ironic, I think, that for the first time in my pastoral career, I have brought my reading glasses. I realized this year I am really struggling to read my own Bible these days. And I made it 45 years, so it was a good run. But it has come to this. And I've seen many of you ahead of me on this journey. And some of you started at a young age with glasses, so you're probably like, cry me a river, Pastor Rick. I get it, not trying to brag. But I did have a good run, and you will see me with some reading glasses. And I just think it's so perfectly timed with our sermon series, trying to see with new eyes. And if you have your Bibles, our message comes from Luke chapter 7 this morning. Luke chapter 7, and I've told you that these sermons are building on each other. So last time, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the power of looking at the world, looking at our lives with healthy eyes. And Jesus in Matthew 6 talked about how important that is. And if all we see is darkness, how great is the darkness within us, if that's all we can see out here. And the privilege of seeing the light. And now Jesus is going to get it very personal with us. In the next two sermons, I want to get very personal with you about how seeing things through Jesus' eyes, seeing things through God's eyes, seeing it through God's perspective can change your life. But there may be some things you don't want to change. And so we're going to just dive right in and see what Jesus has to say. And in this story, starting in verse 36 of Luke chapter 7, we see that Jesus had been invited to dinner, verse 36, and he went to a Pharisee's house. And he was reclining at the table when, in verse 37, a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating in the Pharisee's house. So she brought an alabaster jar of perfume, and as she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. She wiped them with her hair and kissed them and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man knew, if he were a prophet, he would know who is touching him, what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." And Jesus answered him, which is interesting because he said it to himself. Jesus, knowing his thoughts, said, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. "There were two men, and they owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Now, a denarii was about a day's wage. That's about how much money that represented. So 500 days' wages, that's a lot, and 50, still quite a bit. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he canceled the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more?" And I suppose you would answer like Simon. Simon said, "Well, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt canceled." And Jesus said, "You have judged correctly." You have judged correctly. There are several things in this short little parable of Jesus that I find very striking and very powerful. Number one, in his illustration, two men owed money. And did you notice that in this illustration, he said very clearly, neither could pay him back, right? So even though one owes less, 50 versus 500, it doesn't really matter because neither can pay him back. Now, 50 days' wages is still a substantial amount of money. If I were come to your house and demand that you give me 50 days' wages of what you're paid, you would probably struggle a little bit to come up with that amount of money. Unless you're unemployed, at which you would laugh at me, and say, here you go. Joke's on you, I don't make anything. But if you have a decent salary, then that is a lot of money, 50 days. Now the other gentleman owes 500 days worth. So that's, if you know your math, over a year, almost a year and a half worth that they owe. And that is a significant amount of money to try to come up with to pay the debt. And so as we're looking at this parable, it's easy for us to kind of jump to the spiritual lesson and say, well, obviously he's talking about how God has forgiven us and kind of like we owe God and he forgives us and we should forgive others maybe. But what's interesting is Jesus ties this piece about forgiveness to love. Did you notice that? He ties it directly to the subject of love, which is perfect because when I picked this sermon, I did not realize it was right next to Valentine's Day. Now, I don't know how you feel about Valentine's Day. I find it to be one of those days that people either hate or love. And some bit of extreme seem to come out at Valentine's Day. I have some friends who are romantics, and they just love it, and it's the day of love, and all these wonderful things that you can do, and buy the flowers and the chocolates, and go out to eat, and have a date, and whatever else you could incorporate. And then I have some friends who are a little more cynical of nature, and it is their least favorite day. And they say, oh, it's just all about marketing, and just another way that they can get you to spend money and make you feel bad and disappoint the person you love, You can kind of go both ways with it. But whatever you think about it, love is at the essence of the gospel message. And Jesus here ties love specifically to forgiveness. And he asks the question to Simon and to us, if you're forgiven 500 or if you're forgiven 50, of the two, which do you think would love more? And the obvious answer is to think, well, it must be the person that was forgiven more. And so we could say, well, is Jesus trying to say, let's go sin more that we can love more? Or maybe it's that person that sinned a lot, that really messed up their life, that finally came back to Jesus. They have an advantage over those of us maybe that have just lived a pretty decent life since we were raised in the church and grew up. And so we're forgiven less, so maybe we love less. It actually kind of raises a little bit of a perplexing question, doesn't it? Because what is Jesus getting at? Why is he bringing up this message? Well, if we put it back into the context, we can start to understand the power of what Jesus is teaching. And whenever Jesus is teaching, it is powerful. And he doesn't just choose these things randomly. He doesn't just make things up as he goes along. He's very thoughtful and he's very deep. And so Jesus is sitting around the table here with a banquet called by a Pharisee who we learn is named Simon. And Simon, being one of the religious leaders, no doubt sees himself as someone who maybe needs a little forgiveness, but not that much. And Simon, now looking at this woman, sees a sinful woman and is judging Jesus because Jesus is letting her touch him. She's kind of creating a scene. You can hear her weeping. I don't think you can ignore that. That's always a little awkward when you're in a situation where somebody's crying and you're not sure, what should we do? And then to make it worse, she breaks open this perfume, expensive perfume. The whole room is filled with the fragrance, and she cannot be ignored, and Simon is uncomfortable. And the way that Simon is looking at the woman shows that he needs new eyes. And it is that moment that Jesus is addressing here. He's saying, Simon, think about this. If someone owes a lot and if someone owes a little less, which one being canceled would love more? And then he specifically says, this woman loves because she has been forgiven so much. But what he doesn't say to Simon is what he wants Simon to think about and to understand through the parable. And that no matter how much Simon thinks he is better than the woman, no matter how much less he may feel he has to be forgiven, Simon can still not repay his debt. That no matter if Jesus had said 5 and 10, 500 and 1,000, 50 or 1,000,000, the numbers are not the point. The point is neither can repay the debt. And both of them, by law of that time, should be thrown in jail. That is the reality of the parable. And Simon may not have caught it at first, but as Jesus explains, he's trying to get him to think. Because all Simon sees is a sinful woman, and all Simon can think is, why would Jesus, if he's a man of God, associate with her, let her touch him? And Simon is missing the point that he too, like her, is a sinner in need of grace. Simon needed a new perspective. And the way that Jesus saw the woman, the way that Jesus looked at her, was to see someone who finally recognized what a great thing this grace really is. Someone who was so moved by being forgiven that tears flowed down her face. That she spent her precious hard-earned money on a very expensive perfume in order to honor the one who had set her free. What Jesus saw was a woman moved by salvation. What Simon saw was a sinner disrupting his proper banquet. And Jesus had the right perspective. Now, the good news is none of us are Pharisees. None of us would ever do that. And none of us have ever been in this awkward situation. So we can take a deep breath and go, oh, thank goodness, not something we have to worry about. Except that I think it's precisely something we need to worry about. And it's especially subtle, the evil that Jesus is addressing here. Because in all of us, there is this danger that we think by being good people, we think by being religious people, we think by being church people, that we maybe are in less need of God's grace. We have a little less need of God's forgiveness. That maybe we're just kind of good enough that when judgment comes, God will look and say, well, you did go to church, you did keep the Sabbath, you did pay your tithe, you didn't wear that, you didn't eat that. And we kind of have this, and maybe it's subconscious or maybe it's conscious, I don't know. But there's something kind of inherent within us that we think our goodness can maybe kind of win out in the end. And if I do enough good deeds, I'll have enough good, and God will notice, and God will honor that. And in the judgment, my scales will tip for me. And the danger of that is we do not ever confront the stark reality of our sinfulness. And the fact is that no matter how much we do, how many good works, how much offering tithe, how well we keep the Sabbath, how much we help in church, how many hours we log giving to the poor, that no matter how much we do, we can never pay the debt. It is very intentional that Jesus says in this little parable that the money lender canceled the debt. He did not put them on a repayment program. He did not say, okay, well, give me, what can you come up with? What can you get me by next Friday? Now, that's how we treat each other. That's how this world works. If you cannot pay a debt and you call your lender, I'm pretty sure what they will say is, well, what can you give? How much can you give? Maybe we can alter this mortgage a little so you can pay. Because they want to get something. They want to get as much as they can, even if they're going to lose. This is why we have collection agencies, right? The whole concept is the loan has gone bad, they've stopped paying, you're a collection agency, go get whatever you can for it, keep a little for yourself, send some back to the person that was owed the money, and we'll call it a day because something is better than nothing. But in God's kingdom, your debt is canceled. Your debt is forgiven. Your debt is wiped out instantaneously, completely, fully free. You walk in with a loan, something you can never pay, and you walk out completely debt-free. Man, I would love to see a Visa card that did that. Right? I would love to see a bank that would do that. We don't even know what it's like because it never happens in this world. It's a divine thing. But we all stand in need of that debt forgiveness. We all are dependent on God for our salvation, for our forgiveness. But Jesus then ties it to love. And this is fascinating because Jesus is saying, you know, I know how I can tell if you've accepted God's forgiveness. It's by your love. And I ask you to take a look at your own life. How do you treat others? How do you view others? How do you relate to them? How do you handle it when someone wrongs you? Because Jesus seems to suggest that if we have been forgiven, if we have accepted his complete, full, and complete forgiveness, instantaneous forgiveness for which we could never repay, that we might then have a new attitude and a new spirit of love towards others. In fact, later in his ministry, he'll tell another parable, because this is a theme of his ministry. He'll tell another parable about this guy that had millions of dollars that he owed. He could not pay. He begged the king. The king forgives him, and he walks out of the king's chambers and begins choking, remember this? His fellow servant for a few bucks. And I'm sure for Jesus, being the Son of God, that this is kind of how he saw humanity. This is how he sees you and I, because I think we're very prone to this kind of mentality. That we can, on one hand, in our prayer life, in our church life, our spiritual life, accept the forgiveness of God and then go out into the world and choke others for the little bit that they owe us. That we do not extend the same forgiveness that was offered so freely and completely to us. Now, I have a theory, and one of my theories goes like this, and there's several, but one of my theories says we do not do it because we actually haven't accepted it. We talk about it, we believe it intellectually, but never have we experientially accepted that we are completely, fully, instantaneously forgiven just for the asking. Why? Because that sounds like too good of news to be true. But guess what? That's why the apostles called it good news. The gospel is good news. It is that radical. It is that exciting. You are completely forgiven. The minute you ask, the minute you pray, the minute the name of Jesus is on your lips, confess and you will be forgiven. Completely cleansed of all unrighteousness, like you never sinned before. His righteousness stands in your place. That is the good news. All that guilt, all that shame, all the I should have, I would have, I could have, we carry so much. And you know what betrays us is because we're so mean to others. It betrays that we have never accepted his grace because we just can't find any grace for others. And that's kind of forgiveness that God is calling us to, which I think is so transformative in our lives. This kind of forgiveness, I think, is divine and can only come if we experience the divine forgiveness. You can't just manufacture it on your own. It's not natural to us. Our sinful nature, man, when we're wrong, we want to get back. We want someone to pay. We want revenge. We want justice. We want to make it even, make it right, something. And it comes very hard for us to forgive. I read a story, I'm sure you probably heard about it too. It was just 2 years ago in 2018. The woman's name was Amber Geiger. She was a police officer with the Texas police. White female, 35 years old. One night walked into her apartment and there was a young black male eating ice cream of all things. And of course he was startled and he was sitting on the sofa and I guess he jumped up, and she, being startled to see what she perceived to be an intruder in her apartment, did as she was trained and took her gun and shot. And she killed Botham Jean. Killed him dead. The only problem was she wasn't in her apartment. She was in Botham's apartment. She had opened the wrong door. So he was startled, as she was, that some woman in her police uniform was bursting into his apartment. She startled, thinking it was an intruder. And the minute the story went out, it was put again as into our public discussion and debate as to where race played a part in another black young male's death. And so public opinion was debated, discussions were taking place, and the trial finally came. And as many people wondered, they said, I don't know if this woman will face any kind of jail time, but she murdered him in cold blood. He wasn't doing one thing wrong. There was no self-defense accusation or defense that could really be mounted here, except that she was mistaken as to where she was that evening. And what is fascinating about the trial is not so much the debate on whether it was racial and how all that came about. What was fascinating to me was what happened at the sentencing. At the sentencing, the judge convicted Amber Geiger of murder. And he sentenced her to 10 years in prison. And some were relieved, okay, at least we finally have a verdict. Someone is paying for another murder of a young black male. And others said, well, 10 years, that's like a slap on the wrist. Most people get 30 or 40 for a murder. And the debates raged about the sentencing. But when Botham's brother Bryant took the stand, as is the custom in court, where the family gets to say a few words to the murderer, to the one who committed the crime. What he said was so remarkable, and the actions he took caught the nation and was spread virally throughout our country and throughout the world because it was so unusual and so different. Bryant took the microphone and, sitting there looking across at the woman who had taken his brother's life. And by the way, Bryant was 18 was in 2018, he was 18 years old. His brother was in his 20s. And here's what he said. I don't want to say twice or for the 100th time what you've or how much you've taken from us. I think you know that, he said. But and then he paused. And if you watch the video, and you can Google it and watch it yourself, there's a long pause, and he takes in a deep breath. Just if you are truly sorry, I know I can speak for myself. I forgive you. And I know if you go to God and you ask him, he will forgive you too. I love you, and now the tears start flowing for him. I love you like anyone else. I'm not going to say I hope you rot and die like my brother did. I want what's best for you. I think giving your life to Christ would be the best thing Botham would want you to do. Isn't that beautiful? Again, I love you as a person. I don't wish anything bad upon you. At this moment, he wipes the tears from his eyes, and he says something that would shock the nation. He'd say, I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please? And there's this awkward silence in the courtroom as everybody looks to the judge. I'm pretty sure no judge in any kind of murder conviction has ever had one of the family members request, may I hug the murderer? And so there's this long pause. And Bryant repeats himself. Can I give her a hug? Please? Please? And then you hear the judge say, yes. And Bryant stands up from behind his desk. He walks in front of the judge's bench, and Amber comes racing to meet him. I have a picture, you see it there. And she just grabs onto him and starts wailing. Heartfelt, gut-wrenching wailing. Now, you know, Bryant could have read her the riot act. He could have told her all the things she did wrong and why it was so wrong and how this is another life taken that shouldn't have been taken and who trained you and what kind of racist police force do you work for, etc. He could have given her all of that. And she would have deserved it. But he knew somebody. At 18, he knew somebody who had changed his life so much that all he could see in his brother's murderer was another sinner like him. And he knew she needed Jesus just like he did. And he appealed to her to give her life to Jesus and find forgiveness. And when you watch that video and you see her sobbing in his arms, you know this is someone receiving the greatest gift she could ever get. Because at that moment, she knew she needed forgiveness too. And what Jesus is telling us is we all need forgiveness. You may not have killed anybody, but you've hurt somebody. And it doesn't matter what level of sin you've committed. Once you've committed a sin, you still are in desperate need of God's grace. And so now when you look out on your fellow brothers and sisters, the only thing you can see is another sinner who needs God's grace. And it doesn't mean you're saying what happened was right. It doesn't mean that you're saying what happened was just. All it means is that, yeah, I know this is a sinful planet and we all need the grace and forgiveness of our Lord Jesus Christ. And without him, there would be no hope. He is our only hope. And we can put people in prison and we can make all these rules and we can punish and we can get revenge and all these things, but the only solution is Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul understood this, and in Colossians chapter 3, he said it this way. Colossians chapter 3:13, and you know I'm always challenging you to underline and mark and memorize certain verses, so here's another one for you for this year. Colossians 3:13, not hard to remember, 3:13. It's got the threes in it. Colossians 3:13, man, if we memorized this and tried to live this, what a way it would change this world. Colossians 3:13. The apostle writes this, bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as what? The Lord forgave you. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. But you may say, Pastor, you don't understand what someone did to me. Pastor, you don't understand how much it hurt. Pastor, you don't understand it was so wrong of them. Pastor, you don't understand how unjust and unfair. No, I'm not talking about whether it was right or wrong. I'm not talking about how unfair it was. And believe me, I know some people in this room have been hurt deeply. I know that in this world things happen that are really bad things, that should never have happened, that are so wrong it's even hard to quantify how absolutely wrong they are. And I don't know what happened to this sinful woman, as she called in the story, but I know when these kind of things happen, it's usually because something traumatic happened when they were just a child, when they were powerless, when it should have never happened to them. And I know some of us have been through that. And I'm not saying you have to love what happened. I'm not saying you have to say it's right. But what I am saying is what Jesus says to you. He can set you free from the pain and the anger and the guilt and the desire for revenge that traps us when we go down that dark path. Because God forgives you. And He can heal you. Because if we cling to the hate, if we cling to the anger, if we cling to the injustice of it all, then we are putting ourselves in our own prison. But I have good news this morning. Jesus has opened the door. He has thrown away the lock. The door, if you will just push on the door, it will open. But you have to take the step. You have to push the door of your prison open. You have to come out of it. He is inviting you today. He is inviting you to be part of this powerful thing called forgiveness, because if forgiveness becomes part of your life, it will transform you. There is almost nothing more powerful than forgiveness. It's tied to God's love. It's tied to His grace. It's hard to even separate it from these things. All of it is a package deal. And when we understand the joy and the power of forgiveness, when we understand that once we start to learn to forgive others as Jesus forgave us, that it will change our lives. Healing can come. Light floods in. Growth takes place. I don't think that Botham's brother Bryant forgave that woman because he thought she had done what was right, because he was happy about what she did, because he was ignoring all the issues and race relations and all the things. I think he forgave because he knew Jesus Christ, and he knew there's just no other better way to live than to forgive no matter what happens. And Paul challenges us to forgive as Christ Jesus has forgiven you. As the Lord has forgiven you, forgive others. How does the Lord forgive you? Fully, completely, instantly. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to make up for it. You don't have to do anything. Imagine living in this attitude of forgiveness. Because if you're going to forgive the way Jesus forgives you, if you're going to forgive the way the Lord forgives you, that means you have to be continually forgiving, because God continually forgives us. And He forgives us instantly when we ask. He forgives us at the moment that we sin. And He doesn't hold, and it's complete. There's no repayment program. What would it be like to live every day where you're always just forgiving? Forgiving. Oh, this person cut me off? Forgive. This person said something that's kind of mean? Forgive. Mom totally is getting on my back? Forgive. My kids are so disrespectful, I want to put them up and get rid of them? Forgive. And I know this never happens, but my spouse has really ticked me off, and they did it for the 100th time, the exact thing I told them not to do, and on Valentine's. Forgive. What if our first reaction to any wrong was forgive? Forgive. You see, the same guy telling the parable later would be beaten, spit upon. They would shove thorns into his brow. They would mock him. dress him in robes. Hail, King of the Jews. Come on, save yourself. If you're so great. They would sentence him to be crucified. They would make him carry his own cross. And as he is going to the hill called Calvary, he looks at his accusers, those who are mocking, those who are his enemies, those who are abusing him. And what does he say? Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. That's how Jesus lived. Man, that's hard. That's really difficult. I mean, we can forgive sometimes if it's an accident. We can forgive sometimes if, it didn't really matter. Oh, I'm so sorry I was 5 minutes late. Hey, it's fine. I need the 5 minutes to send a text. We can forgive. We have kind of these standards of what's forgivable and what's not. But thank God Jesus didn't. Thank God God doesn't have that standard with you. Okay, I'll forgive a little bit here, but what you did yesterday, that's a week of punishment for you. God doesn't have those levels. For him, it's all the same. Sin is sin. Doesn't matter if it's the 50 weight sin or the 500 weight sin. We still need his forgiveness. It's our only hope. And now he's challenging us. And now he's challenging you and I that we can look at our brothers and sisters and recognize, you know what? They don't know what they're doing either. God has forgiven me. Who am I to judge them? I forgive them too. It doesn't mean there's no consequences. It doesn't mean that you're saying it was right. It just means that you're letting go the verdict. You're letting go the desire to punish, to hate. You're letting go of the darkness that so easily comes creeping in when we're wounded. The darkness, by the way, that ultimately hurts us more than it ever hurts them. As one wise person said, when you won't forgive someone, it's like drinking poison and telling them, "Ha, I got you." Only hurt ourselves. Jesus has opened the door. You don't need to be in prison any longer. I don't know what's happened to you. I don't know if it's death by a million paper cuts or if somebody has really stabbed a knife in your back at some point and you're just so hard to let it go. It's just so hard to forgive all the pain and the wounds and the way that it really hurt and affected your life. But I do know there's someone who understands. There's someone you can trust. Someone who got nails straight in his hands and in his feet. He knows what it's like to be betrayed. He knows what it's like to be hurt. And he also knows what it's like to look at his accuser and offer forgiveness and to let it go. Ruth Haley Barton, a famous Christian author, she says, "It took me well into my 30s before I realized that so much of spiritual growth was letting go more than just adding on." And sometimes the hardest thing for any of us is to let go. And we have a lot of reasons for hanging on, but I want to appeal to you this morning. If God's going to let go of your sin, you have to let go of their sin. I need to say that again. If God's going to let go of your sin, you need to let go of their sin. Okay? And you're only punishing yourself. You're only stifling your spiritual growth. You're only hurting your own soul. It's hard, I get it. It's tragic, I get it. It's painful, it's emotional. But there's a reason this woman was weeping at Jesus' feet. Because when you let it go, it's the most freeing thing you could ever do. And when this woman weeps in Brian's arms, tears are flowing down his face too. Because both of them are finding healing in that moment. And I want that healing for you. And you can have it. But you have to choose it. You have to ask for it. You have to take that step. You have to push open that prison door. You have to step outside of that prison. Now, you may not be able to just feel wonderfully positive about everything in one moment. It may be a bit of a process. Sometimes forgiveness is a process. But what I'm challenging you to this morning and what God is asking you to do today is to start that process. Take that first step. Ask him for help. Ask him for his forgiveness for you, that you can forgive them. Begin that journey. Get on the right path. Head in the right direction. And the right direction is always forgiveness. So if it's your desire this morning as we sing our closing song, say a silent prayer to God. Give him permission. Ask his forgiveness. Tell him, ask him to help you to forgive those that have sinned against you. And ask him to change your view so that as you walk throughout every day this year, what if 2020 is that year where you just learn to look at everybody with the eyes of forgiveness? So that as soon as something happens, your default is to forgive. As soon as someone insults you, you forgive. As soon as someone wounds you, you forgive. As soon as someone does you wrong, you forgive. As soon as someone cuts you off, you forgive. As soon as someone, you become like the God who continually forgives you fully, completely, and free. That is my challenge to you this morning. That is my prayer for you this year.